a few really beautiful insights, and I think the commentaries we've become accustomed to encountering through the lens of Aviva Zornberg, Rashi and Ramban, the Ha'amek Davar and the Meshech Chochmah. Maybe only the Sforno is missing in terms of her favorites, and a couple of amazing midrashim as well. And I think the central insight here, which in a sense builds on something we saw a few weeks ago on the relationship between the Mishkan and the Arei Miskenot that were built in Egypt, sort of relates to step one, kind of the the remarkable nature of the shift from slavery to constructing this Mishkan, and then kind of coming, so that's sort of Egypt to the Mishkan, and now kind of coming on the other side, the complex relationship between the qualities that were needed to construct the Mishkan and the qualities or circumstances that led to the Egel HaZahav and the relationship between them, sort of Egyptian building, tabernacle building, golden calf building, or kind of our seesaw, in a sense, over this next little bit of text. The wonder of Bezalel taking the hint. So of course, we're joining her in the middle of this essay, but I think this is a good slice that stands on its own. This enigmatic energy of the artist is the subject of an important comment by Ramban. And they came, everyone whose heart exalted him. This is said about the wise ones who did the work. For we do not find this phrase nisa'o, the exaltation of the heart, about those who brought donations. Rather, the expression nadav, their heart moved them, is used. The reason for using the expression whose heart exalted him is that they undertook to do the work, although there was no one among them who had learned these crafts from a teacher or had trained his hands in any way to do them. Rather, a person who felt in his nature that he knew how to practice such skills, whose heart was lifted up in the ways of God, quoting from 2 Chronicles, would come before Moshe and say, I will do all that my Lord describes. So the text says that there came before Moshe everyone whose heart exalted him to undertake the work, and everyone whose spirit moved him brought the offering. So maybe I'll open up a Sefaria window so we can see the text from the Parashah. Okay, so the comment here, after introducing Shabbat and then transmitting to Bnei Israel God's commands of all the things, paraphrasing or carrying out what God says to Moshe in Parashat Tumah, transmitting to Bnei Israel all the things, the materials that are needed, and all the things that they would be used to construct in the Mishkan. They leave after receiving this information of what they need to gather and what they need to build. And then we're told that everyone who excelled in ability and everyone whose spirit was moved came, bringing an offering, and then for the constructions. The Ramban is pointing out to us that the people who brought the materials, who made donations, were those who nadva rucho, whose spirit was moved. But the people who were going to serve as the craftspeople were ish asher nisa'o libo, anyone whose heart was lifted or whose heart lifted them up. The Ramban is distinguishing between these two inner movements, a moved heart and an exalted heart, that the moved heart is for the donations and the exalted heart is for the people who actually carried out the work. And then pointing out to us, as she's going to unpack in a minute, how remarkable any craftsperson would have been in this environment. Those whose hearts exalted them or buoyed them up are those who have never learned a craft, yet who know that their hands untutored can consummate the work. This sense of inspiration, of unaccountable courage, is the experience of all the craftsmen in Ramban's reading. Gratuitously, they sense an inner response to Moshe's words, to the mere hint of names for skills that they have never practiced, right? So this, she's just pointing out to us this Ramban, which is really insightful and suggests that all the things that these people were called upon to do, arguably none of them had ever done before. And And so the text is sort of sensitive to this idea that doesn't say the people who were skilled experts in all of these crafts and trades came. It was just the people who kind of had this inner inspiration and said, I don't know how to do this, but I know that I'm going to figure out how to do this. And that was a remarkable moment in the response to Moshe's call. The wonder of this ability to take a hint becomes central to Ramban's understanding of the genius of Bezalel. Now we're going back to last week's parashah, to Kitisa, where God introduces Bezalel. See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur. And the Ramban comments, God said to Moshe, see, I have called by name. And Moshe said to Yisrael, see, God has called by name. That's in this week's parashah, right? So in Kitisa, God tells Moshe, I've assigned Bezalel. And now, as in this week's parashah, Moshe is transmitting all of this to Bnei Israel after everybody, the various, potentially capable people came, brought things and offered their services. Moshe then says to them, okay, Bezalel is going to be in charge. And he uses the language, see, God has singled out Bezalel. The reason for this is that Israel in Egypt had been crushed under the work in mortar and in brick, and had acquired no knowledge of how to work with silver and gold and the cutting of precious stones. They had never even seen them. It was thus a wonder that there was to be found amongst them such a great wise-hearted man who knew how to work with silver and gold, and in cutting of stones and in carving of wood, a craftsman, an embroiderer, and a weaver. For even among those who study from experts, you cannot find one who's proficient in all these crafts. And even those who know them and are skilled in practicing them, once their hands are continually at work in lime and mud, lose the ability to do delicate and fine artwork. Continuing, the Ramban, moreover, Bezalel was a great sage in wisdom and understanding and in knowledge to understand the secret of the Mishkan and all its furnishings, why they were commanded and at what they hinted. Therefore, God said to Moshe that when he saw this wonder, he should know that I have filled him with the Spirit of God to know all these things in order that he would make the Mishkan. The rabbis also said, Bezalel knew how to combine the letters with which heaven and earth were created. They meant by this that the Mishkan alludes to the structure of heaven and earth, and he, Bezalel, knew and understood its secret. Another amazing Ramban. Ramban's analysis is at base historical. This is a people with no artistic tradition. The Egyptian slavery, the work with mortar and bricks, constitutes a kind of anti-artistic background. Not only have they never worked with fine materials, they have never even seen them. In other words, they are culturally, even a sensorially deprived nation. The wonder, Ramban repeats the word Pele, wonder, of a multifaceted genius like Bezalel, therefore, is twofold. Without training, he's expert in all fields of craftsmanship, and he is blessed with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge to fathom the esoteric meanings in God's instructions for building a structure that is a key to the mysteries of heaven and earth. So both his technical know-how and sort of physical dexterous capabilities and his wisdom and insight and deep insight. Bezalel masters the technical and the philosophical or mystical dimensions of the artist's work. The word see, right, that was Ru'u kara Hashem b'shem Bezalel. See, God is called out by name, singled out by name, Bezalel. The word see expresses the prodigious nature of such an intuitive and profound knowledge. In language saturated with mystical residues, that's especially the part at the end about combining heaven and earth, Ramban conveys the primordial, gratuitous energy that fills such an artist. Contrasted with this enigmatic polymorphous energy are the constructed forms of Egyptian brickwork. Not only do these constitute no cultural background for the artist, in their coarse, repetitive objectivity, they imperil that spark that is the wonder of Bezalel. Indeed, we notice that in the first part of Ramban's description, negatives abound. The people had not learned, had not seen, were not able. Against this background, Bezalel's gratuitous genius emerges with a childlike purity. In a sense, as Ramban himself goes on to suggest, he comes straight from Eden. One can hardly help, however, sensing in this marvelous birth a counterpart, here's the shift, for the demonic birth of the golden calf, springing whole and vital from the flames. Again, we have our different versions of how the golden calf story is told. Aharon, forms it in some sense. Then when he recounts it to Moshe, he says, threw it in the fire and out came this calf. An association of Bezalel with the golden calf is strangely confirmed. It is not only that the artist works with fire, he too appears in the world unexplained, unaccountably potent, like the calf. So Bezalel himself is sort of this sudden, inexplicable, emergent wonder, fully formed, like the golden calf. Ramban ends by quoting a classic Talmudic account of Bezalel's gift. As we read, he knew how to combine the letters with which heaven and earth were created. In combining the elements of the Mishkan, Bezalel is responding to hints from the cosmos. Intuitively, he grasps the secrets implicit in the work, and in Kessler's terms, bisociates, combines matrices that were hitherto unrelated. Ramban's claim for Bezalel, then, goes far beyond the depiction of a craftsman. To be Bezalel is to be the artist who works in fire, effectively to be a mystic, a world maker. Indeed, the Talmudic word for combining, with tzaref, carries the associations of working with fire, smith work, right? A tzoref is a smith, metalsmith or blacksmith. Godlike, Bezalel creates new worlds from elements never before fused. Do one more section and then we'll pause. So we have this already kind of hit the key ideas of the uniqueness of Bezalel and the uniqueness of this situation emerging out of an Egypt with no training, not even an awareness of these kinds of materials. There is a person, and then there are other craftspeople who are endowed with this unique special capability, and that sort of stands out and is wondrous. And in the same breath, the golden calf somehow evokes a similar kind of idea on the face of it in terms of its sudden, unexpected emergence formed. We're going to see the divergence between the golden calf on the one hand and the Mishkan on the other, but for the moment, they're sort of paired together and held as against the work in Egypt. Okay, Bezalel in the shadow of God. The notion of the artist is further played out in the commentary of Hamek Davar. He questions the unusual expression for the artists, Chachmei Lev, the wise of heart, into whose heart God has given wisdom. Okay, so just to see that for a moment. So after Moshe recounts to Bnei Israel that Bezalel and Aholiab are going to be doing this work, then we're told, let them and all the skilled people who God has endowed perform all the tasks connected with the service of the sanctuary. Let them carry out all that Hashem has commanded. The language there. And then Moshe called Bezalel, Aholiab, and every skilled person whom Hashem had endowed with skill. Kol chacham lev, asher natan Hashem chochma bilibo. And then again, that language of kol asher nisa'o libo, anyone whose heart had been lifted up to draw close to the work. Here they translate undertake the work and carry it out. So this notion of the artist is further played out in the commentary of Hamek Davar. He questions the unusual expression for the artist, Chachmei Lev, the wise of heart into whose heart God has given wisdom, as we read. And he defines the gift as the spontaneous knowledge, as in a child, of which art form will prove congenial. Okay, so the Chachmat Lev is some internal, instinctive knowledge of what to do on the empty canvas, so to speak. The moment of inspired choice is an exaltation of the heart in relation to a specific kind of work. Hamek Davar describes a sort of Montessori or Pestalozzi educational environment, I've only heard of the former, in which the child freely and truly chooses his own materials. In this romantic reading, the commentator places great faith in the myth of the informed heart. The heart has its reasons, which reason cannot know. The courage to listen to the prompting of the heart is the gift of God. Following this inspired moment of choice, many years of hard work may be required to master the chosen craft. Unlike Ramban, Hamek Davar does not speak of a miraculous and instantaneous mastery. The wonder is simply in the initial confidence of choice. Okay, so we have that distinction. However, underlying the romantic element in these readings of the artist's work and providing a strong taproot to nurture them is a classic midrash that makes a still more startling claim. Okay, and Bezalel, the son of Uri, etc., made all that God had commanded Moshe. That's already further on into Pekudei, I believe. Uh, 38:22. Yeah, the very beginning of Pekudei, also part of this week's Parsha. Bezalel ben Uri ben Chol Mateuda asat kol asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. Made all that God had commanded Moses. Made all that God had commanded Moses. All that Moshe had commanded him is not written here, but all that God had commanded Moshe, right? Just notice that, textual point, that it doesn't say Bezalel made everything Moshe had commanded him, which was the chain of command. So it literally was God had instructed Moshe. Moshe hadn't carried those instructions out or forward to Bezalel. So we might have expected to back it back up and say Bezalel did everything that Moshe had commanded, knowing that commandment that Moshe gave him was coming from God. But instead, it sort of goes back to the first rung of communication and says Bezalel made everything God had commanded Moshe, not all that Moshe had commanded or instructed him. Right? So all that Moshe commanded him is not written here, but all that God had commanded Moshe. Even in matters that his master had not told him, Bezalel's opinion was attuned with what Moshe had been told on Sinai. For Moshe told Bezalel to make the furnishings first and the Mishkan afterwards. But Bezalel said to him, surely it is the way of the world first to build a house, and then to place the household utensils in it. Moshe replied, so indeed did I hear from the mouth of the Blessed Holy One. Moshe also said, Bezalel, you must have been in the shadow of God, B'Tselel El, that's a hint to his name, in the shade shadow of God, B'Tselel El, for absolutely so did God command me. And Bezalel did make the Mishkan first, and then he made the furnishings. The artist's intuition fills the gap between the verse, Bezalel made all that God had commanded Moshe, and the unrealized, as Moshe had commanded him, right? Why is that space there? There are cases where Moshe revised God's words, and Bezalel simply knew God's will and consummated it. The play on Bezalel's name, you must have been in the shadow of God, expresses this unmediated knowledge that bypasses the deflections of the messenger, right? Bezalel heard what God heard, so to speak, intuited, understood what God commanded Moshe, and wasn't worried about what Moshe had commanded him. In the shadow of God, Bezalel becomes an archetype for primary inspired knowledge. One might even say that he most purely fulfills God's project in creating the human being. Let us make man in our image, B'Tselmenu. To be in the image of God, that Tselem, perhaps invokes a shadowing ability, Tseil, right? The play here on Tseil and Tselem, a subtle, self-effacing sensibility that can pick up on hints, on intimations that are almost non-existent. In a context in which blatant images of God emerge from fire, the Midrash constructs, I think that term is intentional on her part, constructs Bezalel as the subtle knower of secrets, filled with the Spirit of God. So I think this is amazing for thinking about the creation story of the human being, that something in being B'Tselem is this sort of sense of tseil, right? That to shadow is to kind of almost unknowingly model or follow the original thing, to subtly be aware of what that thing is and be able to follow it. And then the relevance for Bezalel is that that's what he does without worrying about Moshe too much. Kind of goes back to what he understands of God and follows that forward. The formulaic phrase, he made all that God had commanded Moshe, is of course repeated many times, particularly in the context of the fashioning of the priestly garments. In a daring passage, Ha'amek Davar explores the implications of the Midrashic reading. And Moshe saw all the work, and behold, they had done it as God had commanded Moshe. So had the Israelites done all the work. and Moshe blessed them. So we've kind of journeyed through all of Vayakhel-Pekudei. Now we're at the very end, after everything is made and set up, or made at least, not actually quite set up. We're at the end of chapter 39. And when Moshe saw that they had performed all the tasks, V'nei asu ota kasher tziva Hashem kein asu. So again, same point textually, doesn't say as Moshe had instructed, but Moshe saw they did things as God, the original communication, had commanded. Moshe blessed them. So now the Hamek Davar is kind of taking this idea of the Midrash that when you see as God had commanded instead of as Moshe had commanded, you intuit this sense that the text is particularly telling us, as she wrote, not following the deflections of the messenger, but going back to the original source. Moshe found it marvelous that they had done it as God had commanded Moshe, because he had not had time to teach them all the detailed instructions as God had taught him. And yet Bezalel, through his peculiar genius, had achieved perfect accuracy in his work. In the shadow of God, he had intuited the precise forms of God's will. Right, so here the idea seems to be not that, Moshe had told him one way and he'd said, no, I don't think that's exactly right. I think God must have wanted it a different way. But here it's that Moshe didn't even get to tell him everything and gave him, the headlines, and Bezalel knew what was originally intended. Hamek Davar cites another source to suggest that just as God had commanded Moshe refers to the original command. Let them make me a sanctuary such that I may dwell among them. In fulfilling this, Bezalel had made each object with perfect intuition so that it is habitable by God, right? That somehow they have to make me a sanctuary that will make it possible for me to dwell. Depends on understanding something about what I want or need that might not even be able to be explicitly communicated. Bezalel succeeded in this task of figuring out, or not even figuring out, intuitively knowing how to construct a Mishkan that would be appropriate for God's will, so that God could actually reside there, whatever that means. In this reading, the Mishkan presents not just an architectural challenge or a test of craftsmanship in many areas. It is a symbolic world that mirrors God's own creation of the world, a formal expression of a large imagining. Without learning all the details, Bezalel improvises and achieves a kind of affinity with God in his work. All right, we're at about the halfway point, so I want to pause for any questions or comments on this this reading and this set of interpretations and ideas. Dad, go for it.
Okay. If you go back to Sepharia at the very beginning, and when it talks about different things that needed to be made, you went through that very quickly, and I thought I saw in there that there were things that that women made because they had been accustomed to making these kinds of things, embroidery or whatever. So I guess because they were not making bricks and mortar, they were not they were able to learn, become familiar at least with different skills. There are
Right.
older women who excelled in that skill.
Right, the weavers, they weave.
Yes. Yes. As I you caught me. As I skimmed past it, it also caught my eye, and I thought to myself, like, wait, the Ramban just said that nobody knew how to do anything, and yet here we have this reference. So I don't know if he would interpret it as, right, because it's that similar language of Chachmat Leiv, whether he would interpret it as, right, because we're going a little bit here based on the translation of skilled women. He might say, the Ramban might have interpreted this as the women who, whose hearts felt the confidence that they could weave, even though they had never spun before and never seen these, materials before. Right, because that's the Asher Nasa Liban. Again, we have a slight differentiation between the Nasa Liban and the Chachmat Leiv, although again, she did cite the opinion that understood Chachmat Leiv also as, that I think that was that first Hamek Davar that understood Chachmat Lev also as kind of able to just kind of leap into this like a child. So I think either one is possible. It's possible still to read this according to the kind of Ramban Ha'amek Davar approach, but you're right that it does feel like a little bit more of a possibility that there was some group of people who might have had some expertise or experience already. And I think you're suggesting that maybe those were people, who were not compelled to slavery and therefore didn't lose that skill or had the capacity to gain it somehow. Am I understanding you right?
Yes.
Great.
One more historical note.
Yep.
The Israeli Institute of Art is called Bezalel.
Yes.
And I think it must be 100 years old now.
Mm-hmm.
1920s, or it was founded, I think.
Yes, and I think we have, if I remember right, there's some famous letters that Rav Kook wrote at the time of the establishment of the school that were, are often pointed to as kind of core modern texts around the relationship between Judaism and art, where he really extols and talks about the deep connection between Judaism and art. Yeah, Rav Scott?
My recollection is that the founder of the school was actually named Bezalel.
Oh, is that true?
I think it was Boris something. I'm almost positive.
Great. Okay, good.
Well, I can't resist going back to the child because I have this granddaughter story where Zoe knows she picks colors and she chooses colors. And I say to her, how do you know which colors go together? And she says, because I color.
Amazing.
It's like an intuitive thing.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Cute.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, good. Let's go forward. Okay. Now we're actually going to get a chance to see, and this happens occasionally, both in Rav Meidan and in the Viva Zornberg, probably more in Rav Meidan, and he does it more explicitly, but here we'll see a source that we actually saw her reference earlier in a previous essay. So the Mishkan, replica of a fiery model, right? We saw this reference to the fiery stuff in Teruma a couple of weeks ago. If the Mishkan represents God's creation of the world, I guess 3 weeks ago, if the Mishkan represents God's creation of the world, the artist who constructs it truly, even with incomplete guidance, is indeed taught by God. Such a view of the Mishkan is supported by many linguistic analogies between the account of the Mishkan and that of creation. Actually, I was thinking that I should open up the footnotes side by side here because there were a couple of important ones. Here. See, for example, the use of leitmotifs such as seeing, blessing, and finishing the work, right? Citing here from the end of our Parshiot and then going back to the end of the creation story in the Mishkan and creation narratives. And certainly Nechama Leibowitz expanded on, developed, and collected some of these connections between the creation story and the Mishkan. So she's just leaning on a significant developed idea. Such a view of the Mishkan, right, that it represents God's creation of the world, is supported by many linguistic analogies between the account of the Mishkan and that of creation. But one may ask, what is it to build truly? Is it to intuit some Platonic reality, an image in God's mind, and to materialize it in gold, linen, and wood, exactly according to the model? Is there an ideal form that, as consummate craftsman, Bezalel simply knows before and beyond words? Or is his intuition, as we have suggested, free to create entirely new combinations of elements, to think new thoughts, whose fitness for God's presence is manifested not in the exactness of the replica, but in the intensity of the vision, right? So two possibilities, right? And actually, not surprisingly, I think we've seen this tension sometimes before, even last week, sort of around, intuiting God's will and sort of experimentally interpreting versus kind of sticking to the narrower sense of the script. And I even think Professor Moshe Halbertal has a beautiful kind of analysis of different approaches to halacha around sort of the question of interpretation relative to what was given at Sinai. And, one of them, especially amongst the medieval philosophers, one of them is called sort of the retrieval model, right? The correct halacha would be to be able to go back and say, like, this was God's original intent. This is what Moshe received on Sinai. And, over time, it may have gone astray or been lost, but now we're like reclaiming that, or even a new halachic question comes up. And the sort of question is it correct because it goes back to what was originally intended at Sinai, even if never expressed? Or is correctness about taking some set of principles and applying them? And even if the answer is, goes back to the lo bashamayim, right? Even if the answer is not what God originally intended, it's correct by virtue of, applying the principles and intuiting something that's correct because of it having gone through the process correctly. So I think there's a certain kind of similarity here too, right? Is in the relationship between Mishkan and creation, is the Mishkan, mirror creation or mirror God's will for the Mishkan because it gets exactly the details and the blueprint that God had in God's mind? Or could it be because even being something entirely new, it somehow follows God's will more broadly or imaginatively? That Bezalel's genius transcends a technical mastery of materials and forms, or even a kind of inspired common sense, is suggested by the following midrash. So now she's going to argue, bring the sources to try to support, the second possibility, not the, reaching the Platonic reality or image in God's mind, but rather the creating entirely new combinations of elements approach. Following midrash. And we did see this before. When the Blessed Holy One commanded Moshe, make me a Mishkan, Moshe should have just put up 4 poles and spread out the Mishkan over them. We must therefore infer that the Blessed Holy One showed Moshe on high red fire, green fire, black fire, and white fire, and said to him, set it up according to the manner of it that you were shown on the mountain. We had this whole discussion of sort of models before in Teruma. Rabbi Brechia, in the name of Rabbi Betzalel, right, interesting name there, compared this to a king who, possessing an exquisite robe worked in precious stones, said to a member of his household, make me another like it. The latter answered, my lord the king, am I capable of making one like that? The king replied, I remain in my glory, and you use your materials. In the same way, Moshe said to God, O God, am I capable of making such things? God answered him, do it in the manner I am showing you, with blue, with purple, with scarlet, and with fine linen. If, said the Holy One to Moshe, you will make in the world below what is in the world above, I shall leave my counselors on high. I will descend and condense my presence among them below. To make the Mishkan according to the model that you were shown on the mountain might have indicated pedantic mechanical imitation, or else a minimalist sketch of the original 4 poles. Instead, the Midrash presents the problem of the Mishkan as precisely the problem of fire, of fires, of 4 fires. And now she's going to explain a little bit more. One reading of this would abandon entirely the replica idea. Moshe's materials that seem to fall so far short of the visionary fire are to create not a replica, but an earthly version of the fiery model. In such a version, there's nothing given, nothing fixed. It is a human improvisation, a total response to hints, suggestions from the world of fire. In making such a structure, the artist ultimately is led back to himself, to the fire within. So a little echo to that fire in the bones kind of idea from last week, to his own capacity to be electrified. The Mishkan as improvisation, okay, so now we're sort of staying with this second approach and pushing back on it a little bit, is clearly an eccentric notion, since the instructions are so detailed and quantitatively precise. However, an element, perhaps a crucial element of improvisation, is suggested by the differences between the original instructions and the executed work, right? So now she's going to try to come to the middle and say, this midrash suggests some idea of really radical improvisation. On the other hand, given that God actually communicated a whole bunch of dimensions and materials and, and structures, it can't be that God was really saying to Moshe, look at this fire, imagine what you think it should be like and make it, and tell Bezalel or communicate something about that to Bezalel and let him make it in whatever way, because there's a lot of detail. So maybe there's detail, but there's also some element of improvisation included. For Ha'amek Davar, for instance, these become emblematic. These differences between the original instructions and the executed work become emblematic of the creative vitality of the artist in the shadow of God. The temple in Jerusalem, too, was not identical at every point with the Mishkan in the wilderness. These changes open up space for a notion of inspiration or of improvisation. A radical view of this kind is taken by the Hasidic master of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. He comments on the first mimetic instruction, exactly as I show you the model of the Mishkan and the model of its furnishings, and so shall you make it, from the beginning of Teruma. Moshe and his generation conceived of the sanctuary by their own light, their own prophetic vision. And so shall you make it. Throughout the generations, you shall make God's sanctuary according to the visions of your own time and place. No single blueprint governs the forms of the sanctuary. So shall you make it in accordance with the visions, the idioms of that time. In such a teaching, idiosyncratic elements may inform the sacred space. Entirely new combinations of letters of forms will manifest the imaginary fire. In this Hasidic teaching, there is a conscious sanctification of the idiosyncratic. No two prophets speak in the same style. It is the personal light of the prophet that gives him unique access to God's will. The Hasidic master does not delimit the prophetic vision to past time. His teaching alludes to all times and their visions. And we may add, texts in which fire figures as centrally as it does in these midrashic meditations on the Mishkan inevitably evoke the intimacies of the human soul. In the words of Gaston Bachelard, we'll hear what Lance has to say about him, fire is more likely to smolder within the soul than beneath the ashes. Okay, last section, and then we'll open up again for comments. The imaginative act to forming images. It is here, because so now we're sort of staying with this. We started with radical imagination, improvisation. Then we said, okay, there's some framework of clear delineated instructions, but there remains some element of improvisation and imagination. It is here in the smithy of human imagination that we approach the images of the Mishkan and the calf in all their similarity and their difference. Bachelard writes of the tension between imagination and images. We always think of the imagination as the faculty that forms images. On the contrary, it deforms what we perceive. It is above all the faculty that frees us from immediate images and changes them. If there is no change or unexpected fusion of images, there's no imagination. There is no imaginative act. If the image that is present does not make us think of one that is absent, if an image does not determine an abundance, an explosion of unusual images, then there is no imagination. Thanks to the imaginary, imagination is essentially open and elusive. It is the human psyche's experience of openness and novelty. More than any other power, it is what distinguishes the human psyche, right? So I think just this main point that we think about imagination as like concretizing things in our mind or creating images in our mind, which it partially is, but the point is that fundamentally it's about taking things that are fixed in front of us and then creating something different out of them in our mind. Yes, those things might also be forms, but they are more and varied and different and about responding to the thing we see in front of us by then conjuring up other things. Images, in all their presence and power, are constantly transcended by imagination. If we accept Bachelard's analysis, then, the work of Bezalel is to respond to the rigors of a questing imagination. It is the faculty of deforming the images offered by perception. It involves swarms, explosions, unexpected unions of images, but it pulls loose from the all too stable background of our familiar memories. The similarity of the calf and the Mishkan is that both come from fire and are constituted from gold. But the difference has to do with imagination, with the transcending, even the repudiation of images. We remember that Hor, Bezalel's grandfather, was martyred in the Midrashic narrative for resisting the people's desire for a fetish. God then chooses the artist as the artist of the Mishkan, one who genetically, as it were, knows the rigors of the iconoclastic imagination. He knows how to work in every kind of thinking work. Even in thought, that is, he is to pull himself loose of the stable bedrock of imaginations and perceptions. And here the footnote is particularly important. Meshech Chachma points to this connection between Chor and his grandson Betzalel. Remember, Betzalel is Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor. So many of these teachings, by the way, Emma referenced in her wonderful Bat Mitzvah Dvar Torah. So it's nice to revisit them from a different angle. So Meshech Chachma points to this connection between Chor and his grandson Betzalel, right? In other words, pointing out to us that Betzalel as this, kind of creator of imaginative things, descends as a grandson of Chor, who was also in his way fighting back against the rigidity of the image of the golden calf. Right, and now she's making the connection. It's striking that Betzalel's precise genealogy, going back to Chor, is repeated in Moshe's transmission of God's instructions to the people. Right, when God says to Moshe, "I'm choosing Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor," that's to like give his lineage so Moshe knows who he is. When Moshe says it to Bnei Israel, does he need to say that? To say, "Here's Betzalel." But maybe again, it's intentional to bring this back up. And I'll just note also the point, and I think it was the Meshech Chachma last time as well, who pointed out the connection between or the in the fire in the bones, that notion of Moshe's connection to his grandson, and that sort of genetic issue of the risk of idolatry. Here it's this sort of genetic transmission of the rejection of idolatry that goes from Chor down to Betzalel. So we have this Meshech Chachma noting, grandparent-grandchild relations that's consistent between these last couple of weeks. Okay, last bit. Thinking weaving work, the bisociative imagination. Thinking work characterizes Betzalel and the other master artists. This work is informed by imagination, in a sense that Rashi powerfully describes in his comment on the woven fabric of the curtains that were made with melechet machashevet. Thinking work. This is weaving work, not embroidery, with different figures on each side of the curtain, a lion's face on this side and an eagle's face on that side. Beyond the technical difficulties of this two-sided weaving work, the description provides an emblem for the bisociative work of the imagination. The mind of the artist is not allowed to rest on a stable image. It must shuttle back and forth across the boundary, encompassing two images, two matrices, separating them and integrating them. This homeospatial dimension of the Mishkan work is entrusted to the best artists, the wise of heart. These are complex spirits who can respond to hints, who do not require exhaustive information. Their mode of seeing is modeled on God's complex vision, as it is portrayed in a powerful midrash. And God said, "I have indeed seen," Ra'o Ra'iti, this is going back to the beginning of Shemot, seen the suffering, affliction of the people. Et ani ami asher b'Mitzrayim. God says to Moshe, right, this is in their discussion about God trying to convince Moshe to go. God saying, "I see the suffering of my people. You see only one sight, but I see two. You see only how they will come to Sinai and receive my Torah. But I see how after I come to Sinai to give them the Torah, on my way back in my chariot drawn by 4 animals, they will contemplate it and withdraw one of the animals in order to anger me with it. As it says, each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left," from Yechezkel. "With that they will anger me. As it says, they exchanged their glory for the image of a bull that feeds on grass." Okay, so just a sentence on this midrash. So in other words, God is saying to Moshe somehow, and I don't know, it's hard to figure out from here, and I haven't looked at it in context, why is God making this point to Moshe here? But in any event, God's telling Moshe, I see things in a more complex way. I see that not just will Bnei Israel receive the Torah, but they will also sin with the golden calf. How is this golden calf referenced here? Because Ezekiel's vision of the chariot has these different animal faces on the different sides, or the throne rather. I guess here it's called the chariot. Yes, the Maaseh Merkavah, the chariot. has these animal faces, and one of the faces is the face of an ox, essentially a calf for the golden calf. And so the idea is, whereas God is leaving, the Jewish people will sort of like extract this part of what's supposed to be this glorious vision of God and kind of fixate on that and make an idol out of it. In Kessler's terms, God's vision is bisociative, fusing Sinai and calf into a new reality. If God points this difference out to Moshe, it is presumably to suggest that a godlike complexity of vision is within his capacity as well. In the Midrash, God teaches Moshe a direction for his imaginative development. Now, there's another couple of sections, but I didn't include them here because we're just at time, which is good. So I'll pause if anyone wants to comment further on the things we've seen. Or Scott, go ahead. And then Lance.
So I don't have any trouble accepting the notion that Bezalel had this innate talent. I mean, we know about child prodigies who, just appear and can do all kinds of things. So that doesn't surprise me. I'm wondering if there's anyone who tackles the question of where the materials for building the Mishkan come from. I mean, we can intuit that, some of the jewels and some of the gold and whatever, and maybe some of the material, but the wood, I don't. So I'm just raising that question because we're at that point.
Yes, it's a great question. And I think it's a challenging question. Someone asked it to me this week or last week as well. It's certainly a question that preoccupies at least the Midrash, because there are so many Midrashim about it, that point to the difficulty of it happening in real time, right? That Yaakov Avinu planted trees in Egypt and sent them up with his children, and where did the seal skins come from, and all these things. So I can only say that my go-to would be the Torah.com. That's where I would go to look for an article on this topic. I'd be curious to see how it's addressed there, because I think that's a place that tries to balance critical scholarship with rabbinic and medieval commentaries and tradition. I imagine they probably have some dealings with it there, so I will look there. But I think it's a good and important question. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, number one, I would see Bezalel as a kind of Yitro who comes in out of nowhere, basically, as an aid to Moses. And I think the name of Bezalel with the L is something that your friends at Torah.com, I wrote an article about connecting the L with Balaam, and you could connect the golden calf with the talking donkey as well. But the thing that fascinates me is Gaston Bachelard wrote a book called Air and Dreams. I think it's in the footnote there. And for him, air is connected with sound. And if you think about Bezalel, the name, it reminded me of a word in Psalm 150. Tziltzaleh.
What's the word?
Tziltzaleh.
Oh, tziltzaleh. Yes.
It's mentioned twice.
Yes.
What does it mean?
Are they symbols?
Symbols, right. Noisemakers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a magic about that. If you think about it, Bezalel, the L, stands for God. But it's also LL, which is a hyper hierophany, but it's really a recursion. And my thought is that you've got all kinds of angels floating around in the Torah, and they spring up. The Ish, who directs Joseph, is one. And there's you got to understand, the wilderness is at once a very profane, sort of flat, unmagical place, but it's also an extremely sacred space. And I think that's why Professor Zornberg was attracted to Bachelard, because Bachelard has this thing about homes being sacred spaces.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Great. Yeah, I love I love those literary and semantic points. So I'm really thinking about the relationship between sail and Tzilat Soleil, and I mean it's so deeply linked to sound in modern Hebrew. A tziltzul is, I guess, like an alarm. Mitzaltzel, telephones ringing, and mitzaltzel. So how sail, when doubled, becomes how something which is very much evocative of almost sight or something visual, when doubled, becomes something about sound. I think is really, I'm very provoked to explore that more. So
Great.
Thank you.
Great.
Great. All right. Oh, Dad, last word. Go for it.
I'm reminded of your teacher, Rabbi Danny Lehman. He once, it was probably on this Parashah, taught that in Bereshis, God created a world, a place for people to live. And now the Bnei Yisrael, led by Bezalel, is really creating a place where God can live.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just fascinated by it, maybe rereading the creation account in Bereshis and seeing how some of those descriptions might be picked up in the description of the Mishkan and the materials and the labor in doing it. And I don't know, something to think about or do.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, another great Chumash down. And thanks for journeying with Dr. Aviva Zornberg and me for another round, and excited to try Rabbi Dr. Shai-Held's teachings. He has 2 on each parasha, so I'll be choosing one for each week of Vayikra, and as usual, send it out ahead, and look forward to reading and unpacking it together. Take care, everybody. Love to Mom and Dad. Good night. Good night to all. Bye.